Welcome to Ride High Cowboy, the podcast that brings you the true crimes of Wyoming. So without further ado, let's saddle up and take a historical ride through the Old West. Joe Hopkinson had been commissioned to complete some dirt work for a new trailer court being built in Bridger Valley in 1974. However, in doing so, he filled in a water ditch that provided water to the Royce family. Unsure of how to address this issue, the Royces consulted with Vincent Vehar, a local attorney, who filed a lawsuit on their behalf, insisting that water rights had been violated. The lawsuit named Joe Hopkinson directly responsible, and after a short court hearing, the Royces were awarded their judgment. Shortly after, in 1975, Mark Hopkinson, Joe's son, returned to Bridger Valley in southwestern Wyoming. He had received a football scholarship 4 years prior to the University of Arizona, but was convicted on drug charges in 1971 soon after his arrival. After a short stint in the federal prison for his crime, Mark hoped that getting back to his roots would place him back on the right track, and he began working for his father in his dirt work company. Mark took control over the trailer court project and began working to have the judgment against his father reversed on appeal, consulting attorney Jim Phillips. While in the process of appealing the court ruling, Mark decided to reach out to the Royce family directly in April of 1976, asking if they'd consider working out a settlement out of court without lawyer involvement. The Royces refused. They had already been awarded their judgment and felt no need to continue the issue further. Mark's callousness shone through as he calmly reminded them that if they chose not to agree to his request, he could simply continue to build the trailer court in a way that would cause as much inconvenience to them as possible. He then calmly left the Royce home. After a month of stewing over this encounter, Mark returned to the Royce home and proceeded to viciously attack Frank Royce, the 55-year-old patriarch of the Royce family. The beating was brutal, but Mark was eventually pulled away from Frank and the two were separated. During the horrendous attack, no one noticed that Mark's father Joe had arrived on the residence, and once Mark was pulled from the fight, proceeded to take his son's place in beating Frank with the assistance of a large hammer. Mark jumped back into the attack, and both Hopkinson men proceeded to beat Frank mercilessly. After the brutal attack ended, the Royce family went directly to Vincent Vehar, who directed the family to consult with the county attorney to file charges. Unfortunately for the Royces, the county attorney happened to be Jim Phillips, the same lawyer representing Mark Hopkinson in his appeal. Due to this conflict of interest, Jim Phillips refused to file charges, which was in his official capacity to do. Unfortunately for Mark, he had another problem on his hands. During his original dispute with the Royces, he had reached out to the Fort Bridger Water and Sewer Board to have the proposed trailer court annexed into the sewer district. Mark had assumed he would pay the initial hookup fee of $100 and be on his way. However, the board had been recently presented with a petition that had been signed by 95% of their membership. The petition requested that the hookup fee be raised. Mark involved his attorney, Jim Phillips, who engaged the legal counsel of the board. The board's lawyer happened to be Vincent Vehar. The board held several public meetings to determine an appropriate cost for Mark's request for the district sewer connection, and after extensive negotiations with Mark's lawyer, Jim and Vincent Vehar, an agreement was reached. In March 1976, Mark signed a contract to receive annexation of the trailer court property into the district with a hookup fee of $300 per trailer. Mark continued with constructing the trailer court, but once he had each trailer connected to the Water and Sewer Board's district lines, he notified the board that he did not intend to pay the fee he had agreed to in his contract. It's not noted what exactly Mark's plan was, but the board decided to do everything they could to enforce the contract. It was a long and arduous struggle, and during this time, several board members reported receiving threats from Mark. During this time, Mark hired Jeff Green as a carpenter for various projects Mark had on the books. Jeff and Mark became quick friends, and Jeff introduced Mark to some of his friends. Mike Hickey, a self-acknowledged alcoholic, and Jamie Heisel had, along with Jeff Green, committed several burglaries and larcenies over the years together. This was the beginning of Mark's descent. Mark's fight with the Water and Sewer Board resulted in another lawsuit being filed against him by Vincent Vehar in 1977 on behalf of the board. The complaint requested that Mark pay the fees per his contract as well as $50,000 in damages due to the threats that he had made. A year earlier, in 1976, 15-year-old Kelly Wachusey went to authorities stating that she had spent the night with Jamie Heisel, including in her statement that they had smoked marijuana together. The following day, Jamie was arrested for possession. In retaliation to this, Jamie concocted a plan with his friend, Mike Hickey, to kill Kelly. On June 27, 1976, Mike picked up Kelly from her home and took her to an isolated spot outside of town. Mike calmly explained to Kelly that he was going to kill her. As Kelly's fear rose, she found solace when Jamie didn't show. However, that solace would be short-lived. Mike took a rock and struck her in the head, killing her. Adding insult to injury, Mike then cut out and removed her genitals to give to Jamie as proof of his murderous deed. Mike then buried Kelly. She was the first to be killed in this spree. In late 1976, Mark Hopkinson approached Harold Taylor about a job he needed some assistance with. The conversation started out normal enough, but quickly turned into a request for Harold to beat a man living in Evanston, Wyoming. Mark would pay Harold $200 to complete the job. He offered Harold a photo of a man later identified as Vincent Vehar, explaining that he was a lawyer who had wronged him. Harold took some time to think, but ultimately agreed to the job. However, in his contemplation, Mark had changed his mind. He no longer wanted Vincent assaulted. He now wanted him killed. Mark explained that $200 to kill a man was not enough, and the pair negotiated $600 for the deed. Harold received his payment on December 19, 1976. However, soon after, Harold had a change of heart and told Mark that he would no longer be his hired gun. Mark was furious, but determined as ever. By March of 1977, Mark decided to try a different approach and reached out to a prior sewer board president, Kenny Neer. Mark proposed a $2,000 cash gift in exchange for Kenny to testify that the sewer board had and was currently acting vindictively towards Mark and his family, but Kenny refused. Mark was unsure what to do, but he knew he had to do something. He turned to his friends Jeff Green and Mike Hickey for ideas on how to rid himself of the thorn in his side that was Vincent Vehar. A lot of talk occurred between the three, but no actions were taken. It was during these talks that Mark learned of Mike's killing of Kelly the previous summer. This was light at the end of the tunnel for Mark. These boys were serious, and Mark might actually be able to finally complete his heinous act. That same month, Jeff Green was caught with a homemade bomb in his possession while traveling through Utah in Mark's car. Mark had instructed Jeff to make his way to Arizona and plant the bomb in George Mariscal's vehicle. But when Mark was notified that Jeff didn't complete the job, he and Mike drove to Utah to bail him out of jail. It was at this time that Mark determined Jeff was not cut out for the job of killing Vincent Vehar and ceased further communications with him regarding it. George was an Arizona attorney and former gambling associate whom Mark owed over $10,000 to. It was at this time that Mark determined Jeff was not cut out for the job of killing Vincent Vehar and ceased further communications with him regarding it. Over the next 4 months, Mark and Mike discussed various means and methods of killing Vincent Vehar and William Royce. Mark told Mike he'd pay him $2,000 plus expenses and would help cover up Kelly's murder if Mike would just kill just one of the two men. It seems George had lucked out. The two men made trips to various locations in the area searching for the perfect spot to kill the men and planned out their executions. They finally determined that Vincent should be the only one to die, and the use of a bomb through his basement window of his home would be the best means to do so. In August, Mark was notified that he was to be disposed by Vincent Vehar in retaliation to his ongoing case with the sewer board. Mark immediately got in touch with Mike to let him know that the bomb needed to be delivered to Vincent that night. Mike went out to clear his mind at the local bar, where he continued to drink until the wee hours of the morning. While there, he met a woman, and the two left the bar, engaged in a sexual encounter, and returned back to the bar so that Mike could pick up his vehicle. Though very drunk, he drove home to find that his live-in girlfriend wasn't there. In his stupor, Mike decided that Mark's plan sounded pretty good and made his way to kill Vincent Vehar. At 2:45 a.m., Mike was spotted by a highway patrolman who was investigating an accident on the interstate leading to Evanston, but was not stopped. Mike continued on his way to Vincent's home, where he got out and inspected the home before throwing the bomb into the basement window and quickly leaving. An hour later, the bomb went off, killing Vincent, his wife Beverly, and their son John. Mike returned home around 4 a.m., picking up his girlfriend on the way. Mark and Mike determined that it was best not to be seen together in public until the heat died down, and went their separate ways. Mike was never paid the $2,000 promised by Mark. By the fall of 1977, Mike had made his way to California. A fresh change of scenery would do him good, he thought. But things quickly began unraveling in his absence. Jamie Heisel was picked up and questioned by police regarding a string of burglaries in the area. Seeing no other way out to avoid a charge, Jamie informed police about Mike's murder of Kelly, offering to take them to the body. Jamie also indicated that Mike and Jeff Green were involved in several other burglaries in the area. Police went to California to investigate Mike Hickey, who denied any and all involvement in both the murder and burglaries, but assured authorities he'd returned to Wyoming. Upon doing so, he was immediately charged with Kelly's murder. Mark, in an attempt to save Mike as well as himself, made a plan with Jeff and Mike to throw the blame solely on Jamie, which ultimately led to authorities dropping all charges on Mike and Jeff and placing them on Jamie. However, in 1978, Mike did go to prison on burglary charges. During Jamie's trial for murdering Kelly, Jeff broke down to authorities and gave them the truth. He confessed to his own lies about Jamie and confirmed that Mike had killed the Vehars. At this time, Mark reached out to Jeff's sister, indicating that he would react his revenge on Jeff. In March of 1979, Mark and Mike were charged and tried in Cheyenne, Wyoming for the attempted murder of George Mariscal when Jeff was pulled over with the bomb in his vehicle intended for George. Jeff testified against Mark, which resulted in Mark, but not Mike, being convicted and sentenced to federal prison in Lompoc, California. While in Lompoc, Mark, who had unlimited phone access, began making numerous phone calls, totaling 114 calls in 51 days. One of those calls was to an ex-roommate, Hap Russell. Hap then visited Mark in prison, where they hatched a plan to kill Jeff Green. During this time, Mark also called Jennifer Butler, a female acquaintance, requesting she send a photo of Jeff to Hap Russell. Jennifer declined multiple times, but ultimately gave in and sent a high school yearbook photo of Jeff. She then cut all communications to Mark for almost a month. Hap Russell, a resident of Salt Lake City, then contacted John Suesta, a friend from Utah with a reputation for partaking in less than palatable activities. During Hap's meeting with John, several $1,000s were exchanged. By May of 1979, Mark began reaching out to his ex-girlfriend, Christy King. After several calls, Mark asked her to hide some money in her bank account for him, and she agreed. Mark also made 2 more calls to Jennifer, asking about Jeff's whereabouts, but declined to tell her why. Jeff Green and his mother had left to Iowa for a funeral and didn't return to Wyoming until May 17th. Jeff then disappeared with 2 unknown men the next morning. On May 19th, Mark called Jennifer asking again about Jeff's location. On May 20th, Jeff Green was found dead, mangled, and mutilated, only 2 days before the grand jury investigation into the bombing of the Vehar family. His body was found to have 140 cigarette burns and a fatal gunshot wound. Later that same day, Mark called Jennifer one last time, to which Jennifer advised to Mark that Jeff was dead. On May 21st, $15,000 was deposited into Christie's bank account. The next day, she received a call from someone calling themselves Joe, whom she didn't know. He asked her to confirm a deposit of $20,000 into her account, to which she said no. Joe became enraged and advised her that he would meet her at the airport to retrieve the money. Mark called Christy on May 25th. She was irate and demanded to know what was going on and advised Mark that she'd be sending the money to his mother. Mark told her not to do that and instead to send it back to Scott, Mark's brother, which Christy did in the form of 3 cashier's checks via registered mail. Mike Hickey was called to testify before the grand jury in late May 1979. He broke down and confessed to everything, including the murder of Kelly and the bombing of the Vehar family. He also agreed to testify against Mark Hopkinson. He received a 21-year sentence and has since been released from prison. Mark Hopkinson was then indicted for, among other crimes, the murders of the Vehars and Jeff Green, and brought to trial on September 3, 1979. He chose to produce no evidence on his own behalf and rested at the close of the state's evidence after moving for a judgment of acquittal, which was denied. After the jury returned their finding of guilt on all 6 charges, they were asked to deliberate as to whether the death penalty should be imposed for the 4 murder convictions. The jury returned a recommendation of life imprisonment for the 3 Vehar counts of death, but for the death and the murder of Green. Bound by that recommendation, the district court sentenced Mike Hopkins to 2 terms of 7 1/2 to 10 years imprisonment to be served consecutively for the conspiracy convictions, 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment for the Vehar killings, and to death for the murder of Jeff Green. Mark adamantly maintained his innocence, although he was convicted of all 4 murders. Multiple death penalty opponents advocated for commutations and pardons, but Governor Sullivan of Wyoming refused. On January 22, 1992, Mark Hopkins was executed by lethal injection at the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Rawlins, Wyoming. He chose pizza and fruit as his last meal, which he was allowed to share with his family. Still fighting for his innocence, his final statement before his death was, "They have killed an innocent man." He was provided a choice for public execution, to which he chose a private execution. Witnesses were allowed to view the body afterward to confirm the sentence had been carried out to fruition. Mark Hopkinson was declared dead at 12:57 a.m. on January 22, 1992. He was the 159th person to be executed in the United States since the reintroduction of the death penalty in 1976. He was the first prisoner executed in the state of Wyoming since Andrew Pixley's execution in 1965. Thank you for listening. I'm Blue, and this has been one of many stories from Ride High Cowboy.